What if one of the most decisive breakthroughs of 1944 didn't happen at a famous city like Kyiv or Kharkov, but in a frozen industrial hub almost no one talks about today? And what if the battle for Kirovograd quietly exposed the exact moment when the Red Army mastered modern warfare and the German front finally began to unravel for good? Stay with this story, because the January offensive reveals a turning point hidden in plain sight. The events that culminated in the January 1944 battle for Kirovograd developed within the broader context of the Dnieper-Carpathian strategic offensive, a phase in which the Red Army sought to consolidate gains achieved during the autumn of 1943 and break through remaining German defensive positions in central Ukraine. After losing the left bank regions of the Dnieper River and key urban centers such as Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk, German Army Group South faced a deteriorating operational situation. Its forward positions extended across exposed salients that required significant manpower to defend, yet the available strength had fallen below the levels needed for sustained resistance. Reports from late December 1943 indicated that German forces in the Kirovograd sector comprised approximately 70,000 to 80,000 personnel from formations including the 8th Army and elements of the 47th Panzer Corps, supported by a reduced number of tanks and assault guns, fewer than 120 operational vehicles across the sector. On the Soviet side, the Second Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev prepared to conduct a winter offensive designed to eliminate German strongpoints that disrupted Soviet operational cohesion. Soviet forces numbered roughly 500,000 personnel across multiple armies participating in the broader operation, with approximately 250,000 committed directly to sectors adjacent to Kirovograd as part of the forthcoming attack. These forces included the 5th Guards Army, the 7th Guards Army, and the 53rd Army, supported by tank corps equipped with T-34s, Su-76, and Su-122s. The Soviet High Command sought not only to retake key urban centers, but also to weaken German operational reserves and create conditions for deeper advances toward the southern Bug and Dniester regions. Geopolitically, the liberation of central Ukraine held significant implications. The Soviet government aimed to re-establish control over territories that had been under German occupation since 1941, restore agricultural and industrial capacity, and strengthen political legitimacy among returning civilian populations. Germany, having suffered setbacks along the entire Eastern Front, viewed the defense of Kirovograd as part of a broader effort to maintain a cohesive line and prevent a collapse that could expose Romania and the Balkans to Soviet advances. The city's position along key road and rail links made it a logistical anchor for German movements between the Dnieper Line and the rear sectors in Moldova and Transnistria. Intelligence assessments contributed to the tension preceding the operation. Soviet reconnaissance had identified weakened German defensive belts, reduced by months of attritional fighting and hampered by limited winter reinforcement. However, German commanders believed that a combination of fortified positions, anti-tank strongpoints, and mobile reserves could delay Soviet attacks long enough to stabilize the front. Reports from German aerial reconnaissance confirmed growing Soviet concentrations east and southeast of Kirovograd, but shortages in aircraft and fuel limited the frequency of such flights. Soviet intelligence, by contrast, benefited from partisan activity and local civilian reports, providing detailed information on German troop dispositions and logistical routes. Public sentiment in both countries reflected the broader trajectory of the war. Soviet society, exhausted by years of conflict, viewed the liberation of Ukrainian cities as evidence of the Red Army's advancing capabilities and the gradual reversal of earlier losses. In Germany, morale was increasingly affected by the growing number of wounded and the difficulty of replacing experienced soldiers. The winter of 1943-1944 saw intensified pressure on German industry, with concerns rising about the sustainability of long defensive fronts that relied on diminishing manpower and supplies. As the new year approached, both sides recognized that the coming winter would be decisive. The Soviet High Command emphasized the need for rapid, coordinated offensives before German forces could receive reinforcements or improve defenses. German field commanders, aware of growing Soviet numerical and logistical advantages, attempted to reorganize units and reinforce critical sectors, but remained constrained by shortages of time, equipment, and operational freedom. These conditions set the stage for the January offensive that would engulf Kirovograd in some of the most intense urban and positional combat of the winter campaign. The opening phase of the Kirovograd offensive began on 5th of January 1944, when Soviet forces initiated coordinated movements across a broad front to test German reactions and identify weak points for the main assault. Units of the 5th Guards Army advanced along the northeastern approaches toward Novgorodka, while formations from the 7th Guards Army moved from the east toward Babernets. These initial maneuvers prompted German defenders to reinforce forward positions, revealing command structures and operational priorities that Soviet reconnaissance had been monitoring for weeks. German commanders, including those within the 8th Army, attempted to determine whether the Soviet activity represented limited probing attacks or the preliminary steps of a major offensive. Command structures on the Soviet side were arranged to facilitate centralized coordination. Konev maintained close oversight of the operation, directing multiple armies to converge on Kirovograd through a dual envelopment strategy. Forward command posts were established close to the front, enabling rapid adjustments based on battlefield developments. Artillery headquarters coordinated initial bombardments designed to test German defensive depth and force the repositioning of reserves. On the German side, responsibility for the defense of Kirovograd fell primarily to the 8th Army, supported by the 47th Panzer Corps. However, the available forces were distributed thinly across a widened front, limiting their ability to respond flexibly to multiple Soviet thrusts. Initial Soviet incursions met resistance from German infantry deployed in fortified trenches supported by machine gun bunkers and anti-tank weapons. However, the limited range of German operational control became evident as Soviet troops advanced along multiple axes. Communications between German battalions and corps headquarters were disrupted by Soviet artillery fire, which targeted known signal centers and supply routes. German commanders attempted to stabilize the situation by deploying mobile reserves, including elements of Panzer Grenadier regiments, to vulnerable sectors. These efforts slowed some Soviet advances, but did not fully prevent the initial erosion of defensive lines. One of the first significant engagements took place southeast of Kirovograd, where Soviet rifle divisions encountered German rearguards positioned to protect supply routes leading into the city. Fighting in this area extended for several hours, with both sides relying heavily on artillery support. Soviet units advanced methodically, using mortar fire to suppress German machine gun positions before launching infantry assaults. German defenders attempted local counterattacks to regain lost trenches, but were hindered by a lack of sufficient armored support. The encounter demonstrated that while German units could still execute coordinated defensive actions, their ability to sustain prolonged engagements was increasingly limited. Civilian populations near the advancing front experienced immediate disruption. Many residents of villages such as Petrivka and Shostakivka evacuated toward the city or into surrounding forests to avoid bombardment. German authorities organized some evacuations, particularly of administrative personnel, but the speed of the Soviet advance left many civilians without formal guidance. Houses and barns along key approach routes were converted into temporary field hospitals or artillery observation posts by both sides, further displacing local inhabitants. Reports from Soviet political officers noted that civilians often provided information on German defensive positions, reflecting cooperation that had developed over months of occupation. Unexpected outcomes emerged during these opening engagements. In the northern sector, Soviet mechanized units advancing along secondary roads encountered less resistance than anticipated, allowing them to penetrate deeper into German-held territory. This forced German commanders to redirect reserves originally intended for the eastern defenses. Conversely, in the southeastern sector, Soviet tank brigades experienced difficulties maneuvering through terrain softened by winter thaw, limiting their speed and necessitating infantry-led assaults instead of armored breakthroughs. Morale among troops on both sides reflected the evolving situation. Soviet soldiers, confident in the strength of their numbers and artillery support, pressed forward despite harsh weather conditions and the risk of counterattacks. German troops, though aware of the deteriorating strategic position, maintained discipline as they attempted to hold key positions. Reports from German field officers noted rising concerns about ammunition shortages and the difficulty of reinforcing forward units under Soviet fire. As 6th January approached, the cumulative effects of these initial engagements became evident. Soviet forces had secured several forward positions that threatened to envelop German defenses east and northeast of Kirovograd. German commanders, recognizing the growing danger, began preparing fallback positions closer to the city while requesting additional reinforcements. The opening phase, therefore, set the tone for the intense fighting that would follow, as both sides prepared for the next stage of the January offensive. The strategic planning behind the Kirovograd offensive developed throughout late December 1943, as the Soviet High Command sought to exploit the momentum gained from previous operations along the Dnieper. The Second Ukrainian Front was assigned multiple objectives that extended beyond the immediate capture of the city. These included the fragmentation of German defensive cohesion in central Ukraine, the destruction of German operational reserves positioned west of the Dnieper Bend, and the creation of favorable conditions for future offensives toward Uman, Kremenchuk, and the southern Bug region. The overarching plan relied on coordinated breakthroughs by several armies operating on parallel axes, with the aim of encircling significant German forces concentrated around Kirovograd. Konev's planning process emphasized synchronized movements, concentrated artillery fire, and the exploitation of gaps in German defenses. Staff officers of the Second Ukrainian Front conducted detailed terrain studies, identifying locations where winter conditions would assist or hinder offensive progress. Frozen ground improved mobility for tanks and mechanized units, but thawing areas posed risks of immobilization. The plan called for the 5th Guards Army to attack from the northeast, the 7th Guards Army from the east, and the 53rd Army from the southeast. Simultaneously, the 5th Guards Tank Corps and elements of the 7th Mechanized Corps were designated as breakthrough exploitation forces, tasked with advancing rapidly once German lines were breached. German planning reflected a different set of priorities. The 8th Army, under pressure across a front that stretched thinly from Kirovograd to Kryvyi Rih, sought primarily to maintain existing defensive positions until reinforcements could arrive. The German High Command placed significant emphasis on fortified lines, anti-tank barriers, and the deployment of mobile reserves capable of counterattacking at key points. However, by December 1943, the 47th Panzer Corps lacked the armored strength required for large-scale counteroffensive operations. Intelligence reports indicated that many divisions were operating at 50 to 60% of their authorized manpower. Tank battalions, theoretically equipped with 80 to 100 vehicles, in practice fielded fewer than 20 operational tanks due to mechanical failures and combat losses. Supply lines were another major factor influencing planning on both sides. Soviet logistics benefited from shorter supply routes and increasing rail traffic restored behind the front. Ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles were stockpiled in forward depots established around Znamianka and Alexandria. Artillery units reported adequate shells for multi-hour preparatory bombardments. The Red Army also prepared large quantities of bridging equipment to facilitate rapid river crossings. By contrast, German supply networks were strained by insufficient rail capacity, partisan attacks on transport routes, and the retreat from earlier defensive lines. Fuel shortages forced German commanders to prioritize armored operations, leaving many infantry units undersupplied during critical phases of the battle. Miscalculations shaped the unfolding operation. The Soviet command underestimated the staying power of several German divisions positioned along the direct approaches to Kirovograd. These units, though weakened, had constructed multiple defensive belts during the preceding months. This led Soviet planners to expect faster breakthroughs in certain sectors than actually occurred. On the German side, Intelligence assessments underestimated the scale of Soviet force concentrations near the northeastern and southeastern approaches to the city. German analysts initially expected a limited operation similar to previous winter offensives, not a coordinated envelopment supported by multiple tank corps. Propaganda also played a role in shaping expectations. Soviet publications highlighted the approaching liberation of central Ukrainian cities, reinforcing the sense of an irreversible advance. This messaging aimed to strengthen morale among troops and civilians alike, emphasizing the operational capability of the Red Army. German propaganda, struggling to reconcile deteriorating conditions with the need to maintain public confidence, portrayed the coming battles as defensive actions intended to protect vital logistical hubs. Internal reports, however, acknowledged that German forces lacked the reserves necessary to sustain prolonged combat against numerically superior Soviet armies. Doctrinal considerations influenced the methods used in the operation. The Red Army applied principles of deep operations, integrating coordinated assaults across multiple echelons with rapid exploitation once breakthroughs were achieved. Artillery was concentrated in densities reaching 150 to 200 guns per kilometer on key sectors, reflecting a shift toward overwhelming fire preparation before infantry and tank assaults. German defensive doctrine emphasized elastic defense, local counterattacks, and the use of terrain to slow Soviet advances. However, executing these concepts required maneuverability and armored support that many German units no longer possessed. Preparations in the final days before the offensive involved large-scale troop repositioning and careful timing. Soviet forces moved into assault positions under cover of night to avoid German aerial reconnaissance. Engineers cleared minefields, prepared firing positions, and established communication lines linking divisional and corps headquarters. German units likewise strengthened their fortifications, dug new trenches, laid additional mine belts, and deployed anti-tank weapons along expected avenues of advance. Despite these efforts, shortages in manpower and fortification materials limited the robustness of German defenses. By the first week of January 1944, both sides had completed their preparations under the constraints of winter weather, operational urgency, and logistical limitations. The stage was set for a major confrontation that would test the effectiveness of Soviet strategic planning and the resilience of German defensive doctrine. The next phase would reveal how these carefully constructed plans performed once the clash around Kirovograd moved from preparation to full-scale combat. The first major engagements of the Kirovograd offensive unfolded on 7 January 1944, when Soviet artillery opened sustained bombardments across the northeastern, eastern, and southeastern sectors surrounding the city. The preparatory fire, lasting several hours, targeted German fortifications, communication nodes, and suspected reserve assembly areas. Soviet frontline reports recorded the use of hundreds of guns and mortars per kilometer in key sectors, signaling the transition from probing attacks to a full-scale assault. German units, positioned in dugouts and reinforced trenches, endured significant structural damage. Communications between battalions and regiments were interrupted as telephone lines were severed, forcing reliance on runners and limited radio transmissions. Following the bombardment, Soviet rifle divisions advanced in dense formations, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns tasked with neutralizing strongpoints. On the northeastern axis, units of the 5th Guards Army engaged German infantry from the 106th and 282nd Infantry Divisions. These German formations, though weakened from earlier operations, mounted organized resistance from fortified positions that included machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, and mine belts. The initial Soviet assaults achieved localized breakthroughs, but encountered stiff resistance in forested areas that restricted tank movement. Pioneer units were deployed to clear paths through minefields, while infantry pressed forward under covering fire. To the east, the 7th Guards Army launched its assault against defensive lines held by elements of the 3rd Panzer Division and supporting infantry regiments. The presence of German armored units provided greater resilience in this sector. Several Panthers and Panzer IVs counterattacked advancing Soviet infantry, inflicting casualties and temporarily restoring sections of the line. However, the limited number of operational German tanks, typically fewer than 15 per battalion, made sustained counterattacks impossible. Soviet forces responded by redirecting artillery fire to suppress armored movements, while tank destroyers and anti-tank rifles were repositioned to ambush approaching German vehicles. South of the city, the 53rd Army advanced toward fortified positions protecting the southeastern approaches to Kirovograd. German defenders from the 168th Infantry Division and attached combat groups utilized natural terrain features, including shallow ravines and elevated ridges, to slow Soviet progress. The fighting here unfolded in close quarters, with repeated assaults and counter-assaults as both sides contested control of key hilltops. Soviet units gradually gained ground, but at the cost of significant casualties, particularly among assault infantry tasked with clearing trenches and bunkers. German command reports indicated the loss of several forward positions, but emphasized that defensive belts closer to the city remained intact. The impact on civilians was immediate and severe, and, as the front drew closer to Kirovograd, residents of surrounding villages sought refuge in basements or attempted to flee into the countryside. German authorities initiated partial evacuations of administrative staff, but the rapid pace of Soviet attacks made comprehensive relocations impossible. Soviet artillery occasionally struck civilian structures used by German troops as makeshift command posts, contributing to further displacement. In areas liberated by Soviet forces, political officers recorded instances of civilians emerging from shelters to provide information on German troop movements and supply routes. Unexpected developments occurred throughout the first engagements. In the northeastern sector, a Soviet battalion achieved a rapid breakthrough after discovering an unguarded route between two German strongpoints, enabling a deeper penetration into the defensive zone. Conversely, in the southeastern sector, thawing ground impeded Soviet mechanized units, preventing them from exploiting initial gains and forcing infantry to bear the brunt of continued assaults. German commanders exploited this delay by reinforcing their positions with additional machine gun teams and mortars relocated from quieter areas of the front. Morale varied among troops on both sides. Soviet soldiers were encouraged by visible progress in several sectors, yet the high intensity of fighting and harsh winter conditions took a toll. Fatigue accumulated due to long preparatory marches and prolonged periods spent in exposed positions under fire. German morale remained disciplined but increasingly strained. Reports from the 8th Army noted rising concern over ammunition shortages, dwindling reserves, and the inability to rotate exhausted units. Nevertheless, German field officers emphasized maintaining defensive cohesion, often moving between positions to direct fire and organize local counterattacks. By 8th January, the first phase of the battle had produced measurable territorial shifts. Soviet forces captured several forward defensive lines, established footholds in previously fortified zones, and forced German commanders to withdraw troops from secondary positions to stabilize the situation. However, the deeper envelopment needed to isolate German units in Kirovograd had not yet been achieved. Resistance remained robust, especially in sectors where German artillery and tanks could still be concentrated. The initial engagements, therefore, marked the transition from probing assaults to high-intensity combat, setting the stage for the escalation that would define the remainder of the January offensive. By 9 January 1944, the escalation of fighting around Kirovograd had reached a scale that transformed the offensive from a series of localized breakthroughs into a broad, interconnected crisis for both armies. Soviet forces intensified pressure along all major axes, bringing additional artillery, tank brigades, and reinforcement regiments into the battle. The Second Ukrainian Front aimed to expand penetrations gained in earlier engagements and to bring closer the encirclement of the German 8th Army's forward formations. German command, recognizing the growing danger, began urgent redeployments of reserves, but shortages of manpower, fuel, and ammunition limited the effectiveness of their response. In the northern sector, the 5th Guards Army advanced deeper into German defensive belts after capturing several key trench systems on 8 January. German units, including regimental groups formed from the depleted 106th and 282nd Infantry Divisions, attempted counterattacks to restore lost positions. These counterattacks were hindered by persistent Soviet artillery fire that targeted assembly points before German infantry could regroup. Reports from German command posts described attrition reaching critical levels, with some battalions reduced to fewer than 300 combat-effective personnel. Despite these constraints, German defenders managed to conduct delaying actions that slowed Soviet progress long enough to reposition anti-tank guns along more defensible ridgelines. To the east, the 7th Guards Army expanded its attack with coordinated assaults supported by tank units from the 5th Guards Tank Corps. Soviet tanks, including T-34s and Su-122s, advanced across open fields despite the threat posed by German anti-tank gun lines. Several Soviet vehicles were destroyed as they crossed exposed ground, but concentrated fire from Soviet field guns gradually neutralized many German PaK-40 positions. The 3rd Panzer Division, committed as a mobile reserve, launched counterthrusts using its remaining Panthers and Panzer Vs. These actions temporarily halted Soviet infantry in several sectors and inflicted losses. Yet the ability of German tank crews to sustain pressure diminished rapidly as fuel stocks dwindled and mechanical failures increased. By 10th of January, German armored strength in the sector had fallen dramatically, leaving gaps in the defensive structure. In the southeast, the 53rd Army fought through complex terrain made more difficult by fluctuating winter temperatures. Thawing ground created mud that slowed mechanized units and limited artillery mobility. Soviet infantry advanced along narrow corridors, targeting hilltops and fortified farmsteads defended by elements of the 168th Infantry Division. Fighting in this area produced some of the highest casualty rates of the operation's early days, as both sides competed for control of terrain essential for artillery placement. Despite heavy resistance, Soviet forces managed to secure several key elevations that enabled broader enfilading fire onto German supply routes leading into Kirovograd. The crisis deepened for German forces as reinforcements expected from neighboring sectors failed to arrive in sufficient numbers. Units drawn from the 10th Panzergrenadier Division and ad hoc battle groups were dispatched toward the threatened flanks, but often reached the front in fragmented form after being delayed by Soviet interdiction fire or partisan sabotage. These units were immediately committed to defensive tasks, leaving no reserves available for larger counteroffensive operations. German command recognized that the emerging pattern, Soviet pressure across multiple axes combined with logistical strain, threatened to collapse segments of the line unless drastic measures were taken. Terrain and weather exerted increasing influence on the battle's dynamics. Snowfall reduced visibility, complicating German artillery targeting and hindering aerial reconnaissance. Soviet commanders exploited these conditions by repositioning units under cover of low clouds, while German mobility suffered due to the deteriorating road network. Supply trucks frequently became stuck, forcing the use of horse-drawn wagons that further slowed transport. Ammunition shortages were reported in multiple German divisions, with artillery units rationing shells to essential fire missions only. Some Soviet units also experienced logistical delays, particularly tank brigades that required steady deliveries of fuel and spare parts, but the overall Soviet supply flow remained more consistent. Political pressures added another layer of complexity. German High Command issued directives emphasizing the necessity of holding Kirovograd at all costs due to its logistical significance. Field officers, however, reported that maintaining current positions would become increasingly untenable without reinforcements. Soviet political authorities closely monitored the offensive, emphasizing the symbolic importance of liberating another major Ukrainian city. Their reports highlighted the need for rapid progress to maintain the momentum of the broader Dnieper-Carpathian offensive. Civilian conditions deteriorated as the fighting intensified. Villages on the outskirts of Kirovograd were evacuated under fire as civilians fled bombardments and advancing front lines. Some areas were temporarily cut off from both sides, leaving residents without access to food or medical care. Soviet units advancing into recently vacated settlements documented significant destruction of infrastructure due to German demolitions. German commanders authorized the evacuation of administrative personnel and essential files, but limited transport meant large quantities of supplies and equipment had to be abandoned or destroyed. By 11th January, the escalating crisis had reshaped the broader operational landscape. Soviet penetrations threatened to isolate German forces positioned directly east of Kirovograd, while pressure from the north and southeast prevented organized redeployment. German command faced the urgent question of whether to withdraw from the city or attempt to hold it in the hope of stabilizing the front. The Soviet High Command, recognizing the strategic opportunity created by German vulnerability, accelerated preparations for broader encirclement maneuvers that would define the next stage of the operation. By 12th of January 1944, the Kirovograd operation reached its peak intensity. The cumulative effects of Soviet artillery density, coordinated infantry armor assaults, and continued pressure from multiple directions forced the battle into its decisive stage. Both armies faced the heaviest fighting of the offensive as the Soviet command attempted to achieve full operational encirclement, while the German Eighth Army struggled to avoid isolation and maintain a coherent defensive line. The concentration of forces, the scale of artillery expenditure, and the tempo of maneuver reached levels unmatched in previous days, marking this phase as the crucial moment of the January campaign. The 5th Guards Army, attacking from the northeast, committed its second echelon units to widen the breach achieved earlier in the week. Rifle divisions that had been held in reserve now moved toward the front, supported by additional artillery regiments and mortar battalions. Soviet artillery planners concentrated approximately 200 to 250 guns per kilometer along the most critical axis near Novgorodka, delivering sustained barrages that disrupted German defensive coordination. German infantry, already weakened from continuous fighting, struggled to re-establish communication between companies and battalions. Reports from German headquarters indicated that some forward positions lost all functioning radio equipment due to bombardment, leaving units dependent on runners who often failed to reach their destinations. In the eastern sector, the 7th Guards Army conducted its largest coordinated assault of the operation. Soviet command committed 2 tank brigades from the 5th Guards Tank Corps to exploit gaps created by earlier advances. T-34s and Su-76 moved across open ground covered by smoke screens intended to obscure German anti-tank crews. Several vehicles were struck by German POC-40s and 75mm guns positioned in depth, yet Soviet infantry maintained momentum by advancing in close cooperation with armor. German defenders, including remnants of the 3rd Panzer Division and attached infantry units, attempted counterattacks with small groups of tanks supported by armored half-tracks. However, the limited armored strength, fewer than 10 operational Panthers reported in one battalion, restricted the scale of these actions. To the southeast, the 53rd Army launched its most intense attack of the campaign. The fighting centered on a series of fortified ridges that controlled access to the southeastern outskirts of Kirovograd. German defenders from the 168th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Panzer Grenadier Division, held these positions with determination, aware that losing the high ground would expose the city's defensive perimeter. Soviet forces employed coordinated barrages from divisional artillery, followed by infantry assaults conducted in successive waves to exhaust German ammunition supplies. By the evening of 12th of January, Soviet units had secured several key elevations, allowing forward observers to direct fire deeper into German-held territory. High command decisions during this peak period shaped the operational course of the battle. Konev ordered an acceleration of the envelopment maneuver by deploying mobile groups to bypass remaining German strongpoints and severe withdrawal routes leading westward. Soviet headquarters emphasized rapid exploitation of breakthroughs before German forces could retreat in organized formations. On the German side, the 8th Army requested permission to withdraw to secondary defensive positions closer to Novoukrayinka and Maloviska. However, authorization from higher command arrived late, forcing field units to maintain positions under increasingly unsustainable conditions. This delay created bottlenecks on key roads as German columns attempted to withdraw simultaneously under Soviet fire. Civilian suffering reached its height during this phase. Artillery strikes on the outskirts of Kirovograd destroyed homes, barns, and workshops that had been requisitioned for military use. Residents who had not evacuated earlier took shelter in basements, often without heat or adequate supplies. Soviet forces entering recently abandoned villages reported significant devastation, with wells contaminated, livestock dispersed, and public buildings damaged by German demolitions. In areas still held by German defenders, civilians had limited access to food, as supply lines prioritized military transport. Several villages experienced temporary isolation when fighting cut off major roads. Urban combat began on the northeastern and eastern edges of Kirovograd as Soviet units approached the city limits. The outer neighborhoods consisted of low wooden structures and industrial buildings, which provided cover for German machine gun and sniper positions. Soviet infantry advanced cautiously, supported by direct fire artillery positioned in open fields outside the city. Engineers cleared mines and barricades left by retreating German troops, enabling the movement of tanks and self-propelled guns into the urban perimeter. German defenders used narrow streets and industrial facilities to stage delaying actions, aiming to slow the Soviet advance long enough for units still positioned east of the city to withdraw. Logistical pressure intensified on both sides. German artillery units reported ammunition shortages severe enough to limit firing to priority targets. Fuel shortages hampered the movement of armored vehicles and supply convoys, forcing some units to abandon heavy equipment. Soviet logistics remained functional but strained. Rapid advances required constant movement of ammunition trucks, bridging units, and medical teams. Tank brigades advancing toward the city center reported delays due to shortages of fuel and spare parts. Nevertheless, the density of Soviet supply lines ensured continuous pressure during the peak of the operation. Air operations played a secondary but still significant role. The Luftwaffe, operating from airfields farther west, conducted limited sorties aimed at disrupting Soviet concentrations. However, the reduced number of operational aircraft, often fewer than 20 available for direct support, limited the impact. The Red Air Force maintained local air superiority, providing reconnaissance and occasional ground attack missions that targeted German traffic attempting to retreat from the city. By 13th of January, the peak phase had transformed the tactical and operational situation irreversibly. Soviet forces had broken through multiple layers of German defenses, advanced into the outskirts of Kirovograd, and created conditions that threatened to isolate the remaining German units still positioned east and southeast of the city. German forces, although still resisting in several strong points, faced shrinking options for maintaining a coherent line. The next phase of the battle would determine whether they could extract meaningful combat power from the encircled region, or whether Soviet pressure would complete the destruction of the Kirovograd grouping. As Soviet forces deepened their penetration into the German defensive system around Kirovograd, the battle transitioned into a phase defined by resistance, adaptation, and continuous tactical improvisation on both sides. From 13 to 15th of January 1944, the struggle became less about expanding breakthroughs and more about sustaining combat effectiveness under worsening conditions. German units attempted to delay encirclement by organizing rearguard actions, consolidating depleted battalions, and exploiting urban terrain. Soviet armies, meanwhile, adapted their methods to counter these delaying tactics, employing new combinations of infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers to maintain offensive momentum toward the city center. The interplay of these efforts marked this period as a critical test of organizational resilience and operational flexibility. German defensive strategies increasingly relied on mobile counteractions carried out by small, cohesive groups, capable of slowing Soviet advances long enough to buy time for larger formations to withdraw. Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups formed from remnants of multiple units, became the primary tactical instrument. For example, remnants of the 106th Infantry Division combined with surviving Panzer Grenadiers from the 10th Panzer Grenadier Division to create a composite force tasked with holding the southeastern industrial zones. These units set up temporary defensive points in factories, warehouses, and railway yards, using reinforced walls and machinery as improvised fortifications. Their mission was not to hold ground indefinitely, but to impose tactical friction that disrupted Soviet advances and protected withdrawal corridors leading west. Soviet forces, aware of the changing nature of the defense, modified their tactics accordingly. The 5th Guards Army employed infiltration groups, small detachments of riflemen armed with light automatic weapons and grenades, to bypass German strongpoints and target communication hubs deeper within the defensive network. This forced German defenders to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. Soviet tank crews adapted by operating in closer coordination with infantry, reducing losses to German anti-tank ambushes. Self-propelled guns, particularly Su-76, were used to suppress fortified buildings and breach walls that infantry could not easily penetrate. Partisan activity intensified during this stage, especially in the rural districts surrounding Kirovograd. Soviet partisan groups targeted German logistical routes west of the city, derailing supply trains, destroying bridges, and attacking isolated convoys. These actions exacerbated German supply shortages and disrupted attempts to reposition rearguard forces. German command reported that several supply columns failed to reach Kirovograd between 13 and 14 January due to partisan sabotage. As a result, frontline units received reduced ammunition and medical supplies, further straining their ability to resist. Resource management became a decisive factor. German artillery units faced severe ammunition rationing, with some batteries restricted to firing only upon confirmed sightings of Soviet armor or large infantry concentrations. This reduced the effectiveness of counter-battery fire, allowing Soviet artillery to operate with increased freedom. To conserve fuel, German commanders prioritized withdrawing armored vehicles, while ordering horse-drawn wagons and infantry to hold temporary defensive lines. Several German tanks were abandoned and destroyed by their crews due to lack of fuel or mechanical breakdowns. Soviet forces, though better supplied, also faced challenges. Rapid advances and muddy roads slowed their logistics, causing delays in the arrival of ammunition reserves and engineering equipment essential for urban operations. Improvisation was evident across all fronts of the battle. German engineers constructed makeshift barricades from rubble, sandbags, and destroyed vehicles to impede Soviet tank movement in narrow streets. In several districts, defenders dug trenches directly through residential yards and gardens to create concealed fallback routes. Soviet engineers responded by building wooden ramps to allow tanks to traverse rubble barriers, while mine-clearing teams worked under fire to maintain mobility corridors for infantry. In industrial neighborhoods, Soviet assault groups used ladders and grappling hooks to enter upper floors of factories, avoiding heavily defended ground-level entrances. Morale fluctuated sharply. Among German troops, reports indicated growing fatigue and recognition that holding the city indefinitely was impossible. Nevertheless, discipline remained largely intact, sustained by experienced non-commissioned officers who organized defensive rotations and ensured that fighting units received rest when possible. Soviet morale benefited from consistent progress and the visible collapse of certain German positions. However, fatigue among assault troops increased significantly due to the high intensity of urban combat, with repeated house-to-house engagements requiring continuous physical and mental effort. Soviet commanders rotated frontline battalions more frequently to mitigate exhaustion, though high casualty rates often limited available replacements. Psychological strain manifested in the civilian population as well. Thousands of residents remained trapped within the city as fighting shifted into densely populated areas. Many sheltered in basements, emerging only briefly to seek water or assess damage. Soviet soldiers entering newly captured neighborhoods reported civilians who had been without heat or food for days. German administrative personnel attempted to maintain order in remaining sectors, but as the front approached the city center, most civilian oversight collapsed. The movement of refugees became impossible due to crossfire and the destruction of major roads. Despite heavy German resistance, Soviet innovation gradually eroded the cohesion of the defense. On 14th of January, Soviet forces captured several key intersections and railway yards that served as logistical hubs for German troop movements. This forced German units, still positioned east of the city, to withdraw under increasingly hazardous conditions. Attempts to form new defensive lines within the city were hindered by a lack of artillery, insufficient manpower, and Soviet control of elevated terrain that provided favorable observation for directing fire. By 15th of January, the phase of resistance and adaptation had reached its conclusion. German defensive strategies, though tactically effective in delaying certain Soviet advances, could no longer prevent the progressive collapse of the city's defensive perimeter. Soviet forces, having adjusted to the changing conditions, maintained their momentum and prepared for the final operations necessary to isolate and capture the remaining German units in and around Kirovograd. The groundwork for the turning point of the offensive had been set, as the pressure exerted along multiple axes approached a decisive threshold. The turning point of the Kirovograd offensive emerged between 15th and 16th of January 1944, when the cumulative impact of Soviet penetration, German attrition, and collapsing logistical capacity converged into a decisive operational shift. What had begun as a multi-axis push toward the city now evolved into a near-complete encirclement of German forces, altering both the tempo and character of the fighting. The German Eighth Army, faced with the prospect of isolation inside Kirovograd, confronted a critical decision: attempt a breakout under fire, or risk losing multiple divisions in a pocket, similar to the encirclements previously suffered in eastern Ukraine. Soviet forces, aware that the moment for decisive action had arrived, intensified their efforts to seal the remaining corridors west of the city. The most decisive Soviet advance occurred northwest of Kirovograd, where elements of the 5th Guards Army linked up with forward detachments from the 7th Guards Army. This convergence cut across key roads used by German units withdrawing from the northeastern and eastern sectors. German battalions attempting to retreat encountered Soviet blocking positions supported by anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and mobile groups equipped with T-34s. Several German rearguard elements were forced to abandon vehicles and heavy equipment to escape encirclement. Reports from the German 47th Panzer Corps indicated that some units suffered losses of up to 40% during these engagements, primarily due to artillery fire directed at retreating columns. Simultaneously, Soviet units advancing from the southeast tightened the noose around the last remaining German withdrawal routes. The 53rd Army, having secured elevated terrain overlooking the southern outskirts of Kirovograd, directed artillery fire onto crossroads and river fords critical for German movement. Attempts by the remnants of the 168th Infantry Division to establish temporary defensive lines were undermined by Soviet pressure from multiple directions. German defensive positions that had survived earlier stages of the battle became untenable as Soviet forces exploited gaps between depleted infantry companies. The reduced German battalions, some numbering fewer than 150 combat-effective soldiers, struggled to maintain cohesive formations under constant fire. Urban combat intensified during the turning point phase as Soviet troops pushed deeper into the city. Industrial districts, railway facilities, and densely constructed neighborhoods became the scenes of close-range fighting. Soviet assault groups moved building by building, clearing German positions that had been established in factories, workshops, and administrative structures. German defenders attempted to use the urban environment to prolong resistance, employing snipers, machine gun teams, and anti-tank squads positioned at intersections and behind barricades. However, as Soviet artillery gained control over key sectors inside the city, German defensive depth diminished rapidly. The disruption of communication lines made it increasingly difficult for German command to coordinate counterattacks or manage withdrawals. The Luftwaffe attempted to relieve pressure by conducting limited airstrikes on Soviet positions east and south of the city. However, the number of operational aircraft available, often fewer than 15 capable of bombing missions, limited their impact. Soviet air units, operating in larger numbers and closer to the front, conducted reconnaissance flights and occasional ground attack sorties against German columns attempting to escape westward. The resulting disruption further tightened Soviet control over the battlefield. For civilians still inside Kirovograd, the turning point marked the most dangerous phase of the offensive. As the fighting moved toward the city center, shelling intensified. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble, and fires spread through residential areas where artillery strikes ignited wooden structures. Access to food and medical assistance became nearly impossible. Some civilians attempted to flee westward alongside retreating German troops, but many were trapped between shifting lines or forced to shelter in basements until the fighting moved past their neighborhoods. Soviet political officers entering newly captured districts documented severe damage to infrastructure and noted that many civilians had survived only by rationing meager supplies. German command faced an operational dilemma, whether to order an immediate breakout or attempt to hold parts of the city as long as possible to facilitate the withdrawal of units trapped east and southeast of Kirovograd. Field reports indicated that delays in receiving authorization prevented some units from beginning their retreat until Soviet forces had already blocked primary exit routes. When the order to withdraw finally arrived late on 15 January, several German units attempted to break out through secondary roads and agricultural fields. Many of these routes were already under Soviet observation or direct fire. As a result, German formations withdrew in fragmented groups, losing further cohesion. Soviet commanders recognized the weakening structure of the German defense and accelerated their efforts to close the encirclement entirely. Mobile detachments, including mechanized infantry and tank-supported groups, moved rapidly to intercept withdrawing German units. In several engagements west of the city, Soviet forces captured or destroyed significant quantities of German equipment, including artillery pieces, supply trucks, and ammunition wagons abandoned during the retreat. Soviet reports noted that within 24 hours, multiple German battalions had ceased to function as coherent combat units. The repercussions for both military and civilian populations were immediate. For the German army, the turning point signaled the collapse of organized defense in the Kirovograd sector and the imminent loss of a strategically important hub. German units retreating toward Novokranka and Malaviska did so under constant pressure, with reduced artillery support and dwindling fuel supplies. For the Red Army, the near closure of the encirclement validated the strategic design of the January offensive and demonstrated the growing effectiveness of multi-army coordination. By the evening of 16th of January, the outcome was no longer in question. German forces, though still fighting in pockets, had lost the ability to hold Kirovograd or to mount a coherent breakout. Soviet troops controlled the majority of the city and the critical approach routes to the west. The turning point had been reached. The German defense collapsed from an organized resistance into a fragmented withdrawal, while the Soviet offensive secured the operational victory that would shape the next stage of the campaign. By 17th of January 1944, major combat operations in Kirovograd had reached their final phase. The city, once an important logistical and administrative hub for German Army Group South, was now largely under Soviet control. What remained of German forces within and around the city attempted to withdraw toward the west and southwest, aiming to reach positions near Novokranka, Malaviska, and the Inhul River. The chaos of the retreat, combined with Soviet pressure from multiple directions, turned this period into a mixture of disorderly movement, last-ditch resistance, and rapid Soviet consolidation. The aftermath of the battle, while marking the end of organized fighting in the city, introduced a new set of challenges for both armies and the civilian population. German units that had managed to avoid entrapment during the turning point phase now faced the difficult task of executing a withdrawal under constant fire. Fragments of the 106th Infantry Division, 282nd Infantry Division, and 3rd Panzer Division moved westward in columns that combined infantry, surviving armored vehicles, field kitchens, medical wagons, and supply remnants. Many of these columns encountered Soviet blocking detachments positioned along key roads and river crossings. Several attempts to break through Soviet lines resulted in heavy casualties. German operational reports describe battalions reduced to fewer than 100 men, with some companies consisting of only a handful of exhausted survivors. Abandoned artillery pieces, destroyed vehicles, and scattered equipment marked the routes of retreat. For Soviet forces, the immediate post-liberation period focused on neutralizing remaining pockets of German resistance and securing the approaches west of Kirovograd. The 5th Guards Army moved rapidly to intercept retreating German units near the villages of Katarinivka and Pishchany Brid. In several engagements, Soviet infantry and mechanized troops captured German rearguards, attempting to protect wagon trains and medical convoys. Units of the 7th Guards Army cleared industrial zones and railway facilities within the city, capturing ammunition depots and repairing key transport nodes to facilitate further advances. The 53rd Army continued pushing southwest, reducing isolated German strongpoints positioned along secondary roads and defensive ridges. Urban aftermath operations inside Kirovograd revealed the scale of destruction caused by days of artillery fire, demolitions, and close-range fighting. Soviet engineers and infantry clearing teams discovered entire blocks destroyed either by bombardment or by German retreat demolitions. Railway yards were heavily damaged, with locomotives overturned or burned. Workshops and factories had been stripped of equipment or sabotaged. Bridges across the Inhul were demolished or partially collapsed, requiring immediate engineering attention before supply lines could be extended. Soviet administrative units entering the city documented significant damage to essential infrastructure, including water systems, power lines, and public buildings. The humanitarian consequences for civilians were severe. During the retreat, German units destroyed food depots, seized livestock, and occupied dwellings for defensive purposes, leaving many neighborhoods without basic provisions. Civilians emerging from basements and shelters faced contaminated wells, burned homes, and the danger of unexploded ordnance. Soviet medical units treated not only soldiers, but also civilians suffering from injuries sustained during bombardments, malnutrition, and exposure. Re-establishing local governance required rapid deployment of political officers and administrative personnel, who worked to restore order, distribute rations, and identify immediate reconstruction needs. In the rural districts west of Kirovograd, the German withdrawal created a fluid and unstable situation. Soviet mobile detachments pursued retreating columns, often engaging in small-scale clashes. Some German units attempted to establish temporary defensive lines at river crossings, but lacked the strength to hold them. Others dispersed into forested areas or small settlements, where they faced the combined threat of Soviet pursuit and partisan activity. Reports from partisan groups indicate that several German detachments, isolated from their parent formations, surrendered or were destroyed in ambushes. These engagements further reduced the number of German forces able to reach new defensive lines. A significant component of the aftermath involved dealing with prisoners of war. Soviet forces captured hundreds of German soldiers during the final days of the battle, many of them wounded or suffering from exhaustion. Prisoner processing points were established on the city's outskirts, where medical teams triaged the wounded before transport to rear area facilities. Captured officers provided information that Soviet intelligence used to assess the condition of German forces retreating toward the Inhul River. This intelligence confirmed that German divisions had suffered losses that would take months to replace. On the German side, the withdrawal triggered a reassessment of defensive priorities. The Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, issued directives focusing on establishing new defensive lines, anchored on natural barriers, such as rivers and ridgelines. The defeat at Kirovograd forced German command to shift its operational center of gravity farther west, affecting ongoing operations in the Kryvyi Rih and Znamyanka sectors. The loss of the city also disrupted regional supply flows, complicating efforts to reinforce units struggling to stabilize the front. For the Red Army, the successful liberation of Kirovograd created immediate opportunities for further offensive operations. Having secured the city and its surrounding approaches, the Second Ukrainian Front prepared to launch new advances toward Uman and the southern Bug. Commanders emphasized the need for rapid exploitation before German forces could reorganize. Engineers worked to clear mines, repair bridges, and rebuild key roads to support the movement of artillery and supply trucks. Soviet staff officers conducted detailed analyses of the battle, noting the effectiveness of multi-axis assaults, artillery coordination, and the use of mobile groups to disrupt German retreats. The immediate consequences of the operation extended far beyond the battlefield. Entire sectors of the front shifted west by dozens of kilometers. German defensive coherence in central Ukraine weakened significantly. The Soviet Union gained control of a major administrative center and transportation hub necessary for continuing operations deeper into occupied territory. Civilian populations began the long process of reconstruction under difficult winter conditions. The battlefield itself, still littered with debris, destroyed equipment, and the remnants of fortifications, served as a stark reminder of the intensity of the January fighting. By late January, the withdrawal phase had ended. German forces had retreated to new positions along the Inhol and farther west, battered but not completely destroyed. Soviet forces consolidated their gains and prepared for the next stage of the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive. The liberation of Kirovograd would soon be recognized as one of the decisive operational achievements of the winter campaign, shaping the military and political dynamics of the region for months to come. The liberation of Kirovograd in January 1944 left a lasting legacy that extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The operation became a significant milestone in the Dnieper-Carpathian strategic offensive, contributing to a broader transformation of the Eastern Front. Its outcomes shaped military planning, political messaging, territorial control, and the trajectory of subsequent campaigns across Ukraine. The 6 days of intense urban and positional combat, followed by a rapid Soviet advance westward, demonstrated the irreversible shift in momentum between the Red Army and German forces during the winter of 1943-1944. Militarily, the Kirovograd operation confirmed several important doctrinal changes within the Red Army. The integration of multi-army coordination, concentrated artillery barrages, mechanized exploitation groups, and sustained pressure across multiple axes reflected the maturing capability of Soviet operational art. The use of dense artillery groupings, often exceeding 150 guns per kilometer, proved effective in breaking layered German defenses. The performance of the 5th Guards Army, 7th Guards Army, and 53rd Army illustrated the value of synchronized assaults that prevented German forces from regrouping or shifting reserves. After-action analyses conducted by the Second Ukrainian Front emphasized the success of enveloping movements that cut withdrawal routes and forced German units to retreat under disorganized conditions. These lessons informed future Soviet operations toward Uman, Kirovograd, Novokrainka, and the subsequent offensive toward the southern Bug. For the Wehrmacht, the defeat at Kirovograd highlighted growing structural weaknesses within German Army Group South, the inability to hold the city or to extract all forces in an orderly manner underscored persistent logistical shortages, declining manpower, and increasingly overstretched defensive lines. German divisions involved in the battle required extensive reorganization after suffering major losses in personnel, artillery, and armored vehicles. German military leadership recognized that their defensive doctrine, which relied on rapid counterattacks and flexible grouping, was no longer fully workable given the limited number of operational tanks and the deteriorating supply situation. Internal reports issued in late January emphasized the need to shorten defensive lines and rely more heavily on natural terrain features such as rivers, reflecting a strategic shift toward delaying actions rather than attempts to regain the initiative. At the political level, the liberation of Kirovograd played a prominent role in wartime propaganda and public communication. In the Soviet Union, the victory was portrayed as evidence of continued progress in reclaiming occupied territories and restoring administrative control across central Ukraine. Announcements emphasized the combined efforts of frontline troops, partisans, and logistical units. The operation helped reinforce public confidence in the Red Army's ability to push westward despite harsh winter conditions. In Germany, however, the loss contributed to further erosion of public morale. While official communications minimized the scale of the setback, word of heavy casualties and the collapse of key defensive positions gradually spread through returning soldiers and civilian channels, adding to growing anxiety about the Eastern Front. For civilians in and around Kirovograd, the operation marked the beginning of an extended period of recovery and reconstruction. The city's infrastructure had suffered extensive damage. Water lines ruptured, electrical systems destroyed, and major roads blocked by debris. Rail lines required immediate repair to restore supply and evacuation capabilities. Soviet engineers began clearing mines, repairing bridges, and restoring essential services within days of the city's liberation. Local authorities re-established administrative offices, distributed ration cards, and organized teams to remove debris from residential areas. Many civilians faced the challenge of returning to homes that were destroyed, burned, or uninhabitable. Agricultural villages in the surrounding districts required significant rebuilding before spring planting could resume, causing food shortages that persisted into the following months. The humanitarian impact of the battle also shaped its long-term significance. Thousands of civilians who had endured occupation, bombardment, and severe winter conditions emerged from shelters in need of food, medical care, and assistance. Soviet medical units treated both soldiers and civilians, while political officers recorded testimonies regarding occupation policies, forced labor, and property destruction. These accounts became part of a broader effort to document wartime conditions and inform post-war reconstruction policies. For German prisoners captured during and after the operation, the aftermath involved transfer to rear camps for processing and labor assignments, contributing to the larger pool of POWs that would play a role in Soviet wartime and post-war labor systems. Historically, the Kirovograd operation holds an important place within the chronology of the Eastern Front's turning points. While overshadowed internationally by larger battles such as Kursk or the Dnieper crossings, it served as a critical link in the chain of Soviet victories that undermined Germany's ability to stabilize its southern front. The capture of Kirovograd disrupted German communication routes, severed supply flows to units farther south, and contributed directly to subsequent Soviet successes in March and April 1944. The operation's multidimensional approach, combining urban combat, deep envelopment, partisan support, and rapid exploitation, demonstrated an operational maturity that would define Soviet offensives throughout the remainder of the war. In post-war historiography, analyses of the battle often highlight its role as a transitional moment. It was neither the largest nor the longest Soviet operation of the Winter Campaign, but it represented a clear break between earlier defensive struggles and later strategic offensives characterized by continuous Soviet momentum. Military academies in the Soviet Union used the operation as a case study in urban assault coordination, artillery planning, and operational encirclement. German military writers, in turn, pointed to the battle as evidence of the mounting imbalance in manpower and material that increasingly constrained German operational options. In modern memory, Kirovograd's liberation is commemorated through local monuments, archival exhibitions, and historical studies focusing on the region's wartime experience. The city, renamed several times in subsequent decades, maintains a place in Ukrainian historical narrative as part of the broader liberation of central Ukraine. The legacy of the January 1944 offensive endures not only in military history, but also in the lived experiences of surviving civilians and the long-term reconstruction that reshaped the region. By the time the front shifted westward and Soviet forces advanced deeper into Ukraine, the consequences of the Kirovograd operation had already become clear. It marked a decisive step in the collapse of German defensive capacity in the region and contributed to the irreversible momentum that carried Soviet armies toward the borders of Eastern Europe and beyond.